Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining our session today. Glad to kick things off on kind of, one of the first official days of fall, at least in Dallas, Texas. We're enjoying some cooler weather. We're going to give everyone just a minute or two to trickle in, and then we'll kind of get things kicked off. So that being said, Rick, how you doing today?
Well, thanks. Ready to get this started.
Yeah, likewise. And Mike, how are you?
Excellent. Looking forward to the conversation.
Sweet. Yeah, I think it's going to be a good one. Very topical. Rick, you just mentioned, we were just talking, you gave a presentation on this just the other day. And so it sounds like a lot of folks are interested in this material and value-based care and everything in between. So, yeah. So give it just a couple more seconds and we'll get started here. Okay, sweet. Let's kick things off. Again, thanks everyone for joining. I am excited to kick things off. Today, we're going to be talking about just kind of health system transformation and value-based care and strategies, working strategies, current dynamics, vertical integration, and kind of everything in between. So thanks everyone again for being here. It'll be a really interactive session. So looking forward to that. Just a real quick blurb from me before we get started. You might have seen this in the hospitality newsletter, but we have kind of revamped my community offering. We've introduced a kind of a free tier and a kind of mid-paid tier for folks in strategy at provider organizations. We have a lot of good conversations and a lot of good data and research involved in that offering. So if you're interested in checking that out, there's going to be a QR code here and then just throughout. And then there is a discount for folks if you're interested in joining. So no worries, but shameless plug aside, I'm excited to introduce the panelists today, Rick and Mike. Would love for you guys to introduce yourselves and then we can get started. Rick, how would you go
first?
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. Rick Goddard. I am the Vice President and Head of Commercialization and Strategy at Lumis. Been here for roughly 7 years. Essentially what my role is being in the markets, fully understanding the macro and micro environments, recognizing healthcare is super local, but I try to apply as much local knowledge to essentially bring some of these insights to bear today. Background is former health system leader, most recently 7 years ago at Advocate Physician Partners, part of Advocate Healthcare, which is the clinically integrated network / physician hospital organization of the system. That was prior to it essentially growing into Wisconsin and now onto the East Coast, as Blake has covered with many of his reports. But that's actually where I got to know, and one of my leaders is this gentleman here that we're partnering with here, Mike Englehart, and I'm sure I'll introduce his background at APP, but worked at many health systems prior as well as a consultant by training.
And I'm Mike Englehart. I am the president of the Cardiovascular Service Line at Mercy. Mercy, based out of St. Louis, is about $9 billion of revenue. We are, in fact, in 3 different states, and we have 40 hospitals. And so I'm excited to be part of the Mercy team. I've been here for a short period of time, about 6 months, and the reason I chose Mercy was because they, too, are looking at where the puck is going, and they're very strong proponents of value-based care, and they've done some innovative things even before they went down that path. As Rick mentioned, our paths crossed when we were both working together at Advocate, and in particular at Advocate Physician Partners. That was a unique and one of the first, if not the first, to be, basically awarded a clinically integrated network status. It was hard fought. And both of us had the opportunity to work for Dr. Lee Sachs, who I consider to be one of the smartest minds when it has come to value-based care and really marrying quality and this new model of care together in a smart way to allow health systems to advance. I've done a couple of things along the way. I'm sure we'll touch on those, but that's probably enough of an introduction of myself.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks to both of you for being a part of this, session today. If you guys don't know me, I'm founder and creator of Hospitology. I write a newsletter on the business of healthcare, but if you're here, hopefully you know who I am. So with that being said, these guys are just vets in the industry and are super, have great expertise. So this will be an interactive session. We'll be using both, I'll scan the chat, but also we use Slido where you can kind of upvote certain questions that are, relevant to you and those sorts of things. So feel free to join and submit a question anytime. It can be anonymous. And so, yeah, we'll be checking that throughout. All right. All of, pleasantries aside, let's kind of get things kicked off here. Rick, I'd love to pose the first discussion point to you. Medicare Advantage has been very topical this year. I think most of folks on the line know there's been a lot of headwinds in 2024. Lots of folks priced low and to try to acquire members and then got hit hard on kind of rising utilization, V28 changes and so forth. I'm curious for your perspective on kind of those headwinds and how that's affected the kind of value-based care ecosystem.
Certainly, and maybe just a little bit more background on what Lumis also has as its background and history. So Lumis was started by a group of physicians and now on our 20th anniversary of our health plan, Essence Healthcare, based out of St. Louis. So it started by a group of physicians that were essentially looking to create a new way to work with patients as well as work to have care coordination and ultimately leading it to be a 4.5-star plan the last 20 years on average, and the last 3 years, 5 stars. And so just as a culture and DNA focus, where Lumis scaled to being essentially a new all-payer, all-population company in 2010, so approaching our 15th year of Lumis being in operation, we have a culture and history rooted on Medicare Advantage and essentially how it's flowed over the years. The market wasn't there for a while, then it really came hot in 2016, and now we're starting to see some of that as it's crossed the penetration of being more than the majority of enrollees in Medicare. It's hitting some areas where there's regulatory pushback, but also very important things to make sure that the Medicare Trust Fund is stable. So I'll comment on the reason I bring that background is I'll comment here from just a point of credibility that we have a good eye as not only as an organization on where the headwinds are, but also how it affects our provider partners, especially those that are engaging in risk-based deals associated with MA. So many of you probably have encountered, and I don't know if you reported this, Blake, but I think there's some areas that I've heard across the journalism industry, including watching and earnings reports myself, by Humana, given Humana is a good barometer for Medicare Advantage because they diversified away from much of the commercial business to really focus on government, mostly in Medicare and Medicare Advantage. And so they're a good barometer is what they say is really where positioning on Medicare Advantage is today. But in their Q2 report, the CEO expects margin recovery where it's currently staying projected around 3% on margin is not going to restabilize until 2027. So the next couple of years, the executives are really positioning and pricing in that MA is going to have a ton of headwinds, in which this CEO actually countered that was driven largely by the regulatory environment and then rate/utilization trend. So all the things you've listed here, when we say regulatory changes, this is very much prominent in the minds of the payers. And so what you're seeing is several organizations of the payers are retrenching into profitable MA markets and exiting those that are not in a good position. You've seen reports on markets from Centene moving, Humana moving, I'm assuming some of which United as well. So they have many good corporate strategists, and they know what they're positioning around, and they know what the headwinds are, and they know how to position accordingly. That said, their provider partners as well as the consumers in the market have to be aware of what's going on so they can potentially look to the right plans to really fall back in. But I also want to make out what's the impression on MA. And some providers think it's just outright bad. And I think much of this is buzz and potentially populism, perhaps because several providers are just taking a downstream fee-for-service contract that may not be barely at the cost line or less so. So you could take a 95% of Medicare. It's not really good business for you to say, oh, let's to keep taking on these MA contracts. Well, sure. But that all said, this is a great time to come back to the table with your payer and map out how you both can work together to be in a position of long-term relationship in managing a take on long-term Medicare Advantage roadmap to risk. So that can be done not necessarily offloading the payer's risk, which they could be hedging at this point. So they don't want to necessarily be holding the bag of all this utilization growth, but looking to coordinate care effectively with high-performing physicians and developing that ramp. So by the time 2027 comes around, it will not be as unstable And owning more of the premium will be a strategic advantage for these providers that stay in touch with the payers and not look at this as an adversarial relationship to where capitalizing on the fee-for-service provider revenue upswing that we're going to see. Look, I think there's providers that are happy that they're finally getting some margin recovery on some of their elective cases, but that shouldn't just be a short-term up game, but rather have an opportunity to diversify their revenue in the premium ownership space.
Yeah, I would just to kind of continue that thought, what I've seen and what I've experienced so far at Mercy is we're about 54% of our revenue has some level of risk associated with it. So we've built up this infrastructure and we're in 3 different states. So it's really quite interesting, the different cultures and experiences that we're having with some of the payers just by stepping over one state line to another. But what I'll tell you is I think what Rick said is really important, and that is we have a couple of joint ventures, and one of the joint ventures has been a very slow adopter of value-based care. And because they are treating so many Medicare patients, they are basically price takers. And the worst place to be in this environment is to be a price taker in Medicare Advantage, where they're tightening down the bolts and really, to Rick's point, throwing up more obstacles. This is the time to pivot and say, let's have a different conversation. We actually can help you bend the cost curve, but we need some support as far as infrastructure and a glide path to get there. Otherwise, it's a painful process, and it's probably where a lot of the appropriate negative press is coming out about MA, because there has been a pivot. And I believe what Rick said is it's cyclical, it will rebound, but you don't want to be a price taker in a downturn like this. I think it's very painful. And to Rick's point, you're hard pressed to get back to 90% of Medicare, traditional Medicare, with all the denials and the administrative burdens that are going on.
Well said.
Yeah, no, those are great points. I mean, I think if you kind of rewind to last year, Medicare Advantage has really been in this trough, like you guys mentioned. You know, you've seen kind of like the United Health Group utilization comments in Q2 of last year that kind of kicked everything off and sent MA into a flurry, and then the V28 changes. So I'm curious for y'all's perspective on, you know, from a provider organization lens, you know, the downstream effects of kind of this trough on, you know, the clinic-based models, the enablement model, the affiliate kind of models. Is it just kind of like the reset and it'll, you know, they're recalibrating their business models and kind of right size from there? Or is there kind of long-term unsustainable trends here? Or kind of what are your thoughts on kind of those spaces?
I can speak from our organization as one of the, let's say in the sphere of enablement, right? I think looks like a sector now that's being labeled, being around 15 years would be called operating partners, people that are in the market that are.
Congratulations.
So I think just despite the challenges in MA, technology and data analytics are still key to driving success. And I think enabling partnerships have the access to capital and the VPC expertise to drive powerful integration into health systems to support. There's going to be many folks that have been in and out over the years on the basis of, you know, there was not an ability to capitalize on medical cost reductions rather than just playing arbitrage games. I think those have also been, especially if they're on the public markets, have been actually very well followed. So I think there's positioning right now as high performing networks come about to where you can position to be an organization that's well to be partnered with organizations that have significant market presence. And that's why health systems as the incumbents locally, they are well positioned to start with. The key is if they just don't get complacent, especially as new folks are taking on new value propositions to the docs that may have, faltered over the years with health system relationships. So I'd say this is a perfect time. It's like when the market's down, right, to buy.
Yeah, I would just continue that thought. What we have found at Mercy, and frankly, one of the things that we have emphasized with our new strategic plan is that partnership has got to be a core competency. We do a lot of things inside our four walls, but we appreciate to get there faster, we're going to have to partner in different ways than we've done before, whether that be with payers, other health systems to advance AI, care models. I think we're willing to be thoughtful listeners. We are blessed to have the infrastructure and the history of moving towards value-based care, but even we appreciate it's smart to listen. It's smart to investigate opportunities to partner, to continue to get more efficient. And that's something that I've been really energized to see that, a health system like Mercy that's got a very strong track record of doing value-based care is opening its eyes further to new ideas and new partnerships. And we're calling it out literally in our strategic plan. So I think that that's exactly what Rick's saying is you can't build up enough dry powder. And I think you have to think about relationships in a whole new way. And now's the time to start, laying that groundwork.
And I had one other thing to add, Blake, is well said, Mike, is I think with these pop health models, a lot of the folks have been in the right way of thinking in the investment and access points for lower cost settings, right? So the clinic-based models, as you mentioned, it's the right idea. Like doing care at home, it's the right idea. It's convenience. It's the focus of what the consumer wants. The payers want it because it's lower cost settings than really these high cost acute settings. So don't get me wrong, it's the strategic plan. And that's why I think we were all so bullish the last several years, being like, let's make this work. Let's have this work. But I think there's some issues associated with if you're doing a fee for service business model on this lower cost setting in primary care. Mike and I have worked in primary care for a long time, and we know that it's not super profitable in medical groups of health systems or in medical groups in general that are solely focused on that business model, especially, if you looked at the salaries of a traditional primary care physician and how it's grown over the years because of their ability to participate in risk-bearing contracts. So just going back to like some of these ones that are just doing clinic-based models on fee-for-service transactions, either in a low cost using a nurse practitioner and one of the pharmacy chains or utilizing one in a major big box, you have to have a component where you're linked to a risk-based program. So you're participating in that as an access point in the community with a brick and mortar. So I'm actually rooting for these because we as partners and ones that are working with health systems to partner with these organizations in the market to have various spots where people can have access and off after hours or in places that are convenient to them. It's going to come back. That's what I'm saying. It's a cyclical, as Mike mentioned, these things are cyclical. It's just, I think they have to get the right business model right in order for them to really achieve that and think long-term and not on a quarterly earnings cycle of short-term strategy.
Yeah, that's a whole nother can of worms, the short-term quarterly earnings, in that dichotomy against long-term healthcare thinking. But both of you have hit on really good points and are great segues in kind of our next topic. Which, Rick, you mentioned that these clinic-based models need to be attached to some sort of risk program. And so, we've seen a lot of that happen within kind of vertical integration, right? And then these large payers gobbling up services assets. Mike, you mentioned Mercy's kind of strategic plan and the vision you guys are laying out. So maybe first, Mike, maybe I'll turn the conversation over to you and talk about, you've talked about partnerships and JVs and so forth. What kind of growth initiatives are working today and what are you guys focused on?
Well, opening up access is key. One of the things that Mercy's been focused on is to grow its primary care footprint. And we've been very successful over the last 3 years. We've increased the number of primary care by north of 300 doctors. We've opened up walk-in clinics. And we've also partnered with payers like Humana and others that are going to be announced shortly to open up additional access to the patients. One of the things that Mercy did that was way ahead of the curve is our virtual care center. Our virtual care center was stood up well before COVID. Health systems would make the pilgrimage down to St. Louis to see this virtual care center. It was built out of necessity because we have a substantial rural community that we have to service. And so we're not always able to physically see the patients all the time. And virtual care became this gap. And as a result, we have this infrastructure in place that's been really a godsend as we went through COVID, and now serves as this extra layer that we wrap around some of our most at risk patients. And so I think we're on the cusp of some interesting conversations with the payers in the marketplace. And we have something that we'll announce probably at about noon today, which if we're still on the call, I will share with the audience of a unique strategic partnership that we're launching in one of our communities that is, I think, one of a kind. I'm not aware of any such opportunity like this in the past. So we're excited. We're interested. Where I see these things sometimes coming up short is sometimes we've overpaid for these assets. I mean, I think there's a couple on this paper that they've acquired certain assets and they've overpaid for it. The model's right. What they purchased it for and their business plan was overly optimistic. And that's where some of these have come up short. When the payer partners with a provider and you marry the best of both worlds, payers are phenomenal at marketing. They're great at actuarial science, and they understand how to aggregate lives. Providers, when married up to that, actually that's the sweet spot where we can actually provide the care and finish the last mile of service. And those are the types of relationships we think work best.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really offended you didn't want to give hospitality exclusive access to that.
I think you're getting it, Blake.
I'd like to be employed.
I guess so.
I've been sworn to secrecy until noon.
Well, you teasing it is, great marketing in and of itself. So that's fantastic.
Yes.
Okay. So Rick, you've talked a lot about, just in general, healthcare is local and different local market dynamics are very different across the board nationwide. But at the same time, you kind of got these national lives aggregators snatching up services assets and then thinking more as an enterprise, right? Nationally. So how is that affecting, kind of local markets, and how are health systems shifting their strategy in response to these kind of vertical integrators, if that makes sense?
Yeah, sounds good. So, let's just really quickly how we got here. So through COVID, there was a lot of changes, and obviously the utilization was less so, and that had an ability to collect premiums on the payer side to where they've stacked cash and they had ability to invest in downstream assets. So there was a lot of acquisitions in the 21, 22 space. And I'm sure we'll see one of your slides at some point that really shows the stack of assets, and I've seen it a few different times, is that now I think the providers are recognizing that the vertical integration has come to form, and that's also in good favor, could help them. I wrote an article in 2022 that's right in the mix of it, saying like health systems are the original vertical integrators, as they were driven towards being, hey, look, we have all the assets, we have the ancillary, we have the physician groups, we have the downstream services to deliver that back to the core community person that was seeking care. Now, I think health systems also recognizing that the control of the referral by the primary care is also being affected to bringing down to lower cost settings to support some of these risk-bearing models. So as these health systems are adapting to the BUCAs, continuing to acquire delivery assets, many systems are focusing on bolstering their own provider networks to maintain control over care delivery, the referral, and risk management. And I think one of those strategies is expanding in outpatient care, which we've been talking about for 20 years, like the inpatient outpatient shift. I think it's such a cliche, but it's one thing that's happening. There's less so of third party ambulatory PE oversight of some of these ambulatory surgery centers. And I say they're still very prominent, but health systems are investing in them to utilize and give up entrepreneurial opportunities to their either employed or independent physicians to be successful at these lower cost settings. And so I think health systems can respond to this vertical payer integration by transitioning into a virtualized ambulatory and home-based settings. And I think this is like the investor favorite word is asset light. It's like you're not fixed cost heavy at the local site. You could be centralized. You can be a command center, and then participate in these lower cost setting models accordingly. But I think the importance of health systems brand in the communities, as patients still very much trust prominently the competitive brand advantage because their position is closer to them and they have that trust relationship. Health systems have an inherent opportunity to capitalize on that through transparency, personalized care, and consistent commitment.
Blake, if you'd like, I can share the announcement.
No, I mean, absolutely. If you want to, go ahead.
Sure, just went out. So today we announced a 30-year strategic relationship with Alice Walton and her Heartland Whole Health Institute. There will be north of a $700 million of investment in care in Northwest Arkansas. It will also include the Cleveland Clinic in ways to improve care both on an inpatient and outpatient basis. And so it's been something that's been a passion of Alice Walton. Alice Walton is in Walmart Waltons, and this is one of her major focuses. Her vehicle that she gets this work done is through her Heartland Whole Health Institute, and they actually touch 20 states, but Bentonville and Rogers is Alice Walton's home, and this is where she wants to start this initiative. So we're super excited. This, we believe, marks one of the more unique investments by a philanthropist where they will actually roll up their sleeves and work side by side with the healthcare system. And we're excited about, of course, partnering with Cleveland Clinic and their world-class reputation for care. So this is another example where someone with Alice Walton's reputation and wherewithal focusing on care is a really interesting opportunity to align. And her whole theory is care should be available to all, and it should be world-class care. And why don't we try and do something special and unique right here in Northwest Arkansas? So we're excited about that announcement, and that's a new and different type of strategic partnership that we're excited about.
Yeah, well, what other webinar or virtual event do you get where you got breaking news on the line straight from the source? That's fantastic. So congratulations on that partnership. Looking forward to sharing that in the newsletter. And I do see some Arkansas football slander and propaganda in the chat, so please keep that to a minimum. Otherwise, let's get back on track.
There's always basketball season. Arkansas would help you.
Arkansas doesn't look too shabby this year.
That's right.
Anyway, I digress. Where were we? Yeah. Okay. So I actually have an interesting kind of hypothetical for y'all. I've heard from just some folks in conversations that, folks or like these vertical integrators are kind of picking and choosing spots to integrate versus like not integrate acquired assets and those sorts of things. And what is y'all's opinion on vertical integration, and to what extent is it just kind of like financial engineering by payers versus like actually driving like quality and like outcomes in kind of that full integrated delivery vehicle, if that makes sense? Maybe that's a little bit of a provocative question, but just curious.
My opinion is how well you execute. You could stack all these assets, but if they don't talk to each other, then they don't deliver what you intended the value of the strategy was, you're just spending a lot of money and running independent units.
You need to, unless you actually have the infrastructure and you have the people capable of pulling off the strategy. And so I think it always looks wonderful on paper. You have to measure it 2, 3, and 5 years out, whether or not it delivered on the promise originally set forth.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, I think maybe we'll see kind of some separation in performance, over this next 5 years. That'll be very interesting to see. So thanks for that perspective. Sweet. Let's move on here to kind of, the health system environment and health system landscape. We've touched on that a little bit. But, anyone who's been reading hospitology, I've been doing a series lately on kind of health system performance and dynamics affecting those hospitals. And we especially among kind of like the larger regional, price kind of maker systems, we've seen a lot of improvement in margin over the past kind of call it half year or so, year over year. So I'm curious for y'all's perspective, as this utilization environment kind of brings health systems back to status quo operations, if that makes sense, has that dampened the enthusiasm for value-based care, or kind of what's your take on that?
I guess I'll go first on this. What I would say is it's all dependent upon where you are on the journey. So, going back to the original portion as we kicked off this conversation, if you are not doing any value-based care and you're getting crushed by MA, denials and seeing just a tremendous amount of burden by handling these MA plans, then I would say that those health systems are, to Rick's point, probably having to question whether or not they need to double down. If you look at this list, most of these players, with the exception of probably the top three, have some level of value-based care, or it's a key component of, with the exception maybe of some, there's a couple down towards the bottom, but most are doing some type of value-based care. So I think it's important. And I would just say the HCAs and tenants of the world, while they might not be taking value-based contracts, take a look at their investment portfolio. Who are the largest owners of some of the ASCs in the United States? Do you think that's by accident that they've chosen to be investors in ASCs and they themselves have a nice footprint? They'll run the model as long as they need to, and eventually they'll cut over. But in the meantime, they're essentially extracting a toll from all these strategic ASC relationships that all the other health systems you utilize. I would say that health systems are starting to get their mojo back as far as profitability. What they're trying to balance right now is we squeeze down hard on our chassis and our cost. And we're trying to find the sweet spot when it comes to how much of those resources need to come back in order to ensure quality and sustainability. And so that's the pressure point right now that I believe a lot of health systems are trying to figure out. What's that sweet spot? You can't live in a COVID cost mindset. In the same token, you know that we continue to move slowly down the path of value-based care. I mean, what's the old saying? How did you go bankrupt? It was slow until it was fast at the end. How do you move into value-based care? It's slow and then it's fast at the end. You have to continue to make these investments in innovative relationships so that you can have a balanced portfolio. I'll turn it over to Rick.
Just to add is saying, I think Deloitte, I'm always happy to push out great content, right? Deloitte mentioned that 40% is the tipping point of percent of revenue that's driven towards fee for value environments. I think it's probably somewhat a little less, but that's okay. I also equate it to what physicians need is for what we call as mind share in order to tip the scales. It's probably around 50% of your value-based agreements are in some form of a risk-bearing environment to where they're changing practice design. They're changing the way that they're stacking the time that they see patients, how they get people in quarterly. And so once you have different mindset of how you're running your system, and you're not just playing left pocket, right pocket and hedging, but how do I essentially, not cannibalize my traditional core business, that's when you start to see behavior change. You also start changing the way people are getting incentives. The hospital presidents that are at these various hospitals and health systems have an OKR for a revenue target. You're thinking differently about how you're admitting versus putting an observation. So there has to be a cultural transformation to where it reaches that tipping point. And I think Mike just highlighted that it can happen. It just takes a little bit to get that momentum.
That's a really good point. Let me just spend a second on that. When you run a large health system, sometimes you live and breathe all of these facts, and to Rick's point, once you get past 40 or 50, you really think about, you're no longer playing checkers, you're playing chess. But it's the frontline leaders, it's the emergency room physician, it's the note that goes off in Epic to say this patient, we have an opportunity to try and prevent a readmission. And all those little things all those process changes, education sessions, all start to take hold. And all of a sudden, everyone's starting to row in the same direction. And it doesn't happen overnight. And it's just every day you're trying to figure out who doesn't know about this? How do we educate? How do we think about our model differently? And, I'm speaking to the choir here. Healthcare is the most complex model in any industry. I mean, I'm not sure there's any that could rival the United States healthcare system and just how many jumps and hoops and bumps that we have to avoid and jump over. And so it's just been interesting to watch this journey and to participate in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that hits the nail right on the head with kind of health system transformation and the need for that. And, as the market changes, need to be less reactive and more proactive, and kind of getting everyone rowing in the same direction is, the first step to doing that. So yeah, great points all around. Mike, maybe one more question from this slide. We've, talked about it with the announcement today, but are there other kind of more tactical areas of focus when it comes to innovation where you're investing?
Yeah, one of the things that we're really proud of is we have a strategic relationship with Microsoft and Mayo, where we are taking all of our de-identified information. And this journey started several years ago before AI was attached to every marketing piece of material. But it was really with the belief that with this bolus of information, we really could start to query and come up with specialized care models. And it is really starting to bear some interesting fruit. And more importantly, to Rick's point, the physicians now appreciate it's not a tagline. This is based upon millions and millions of patient encounters. And you run in queries, and they are participating in this process. And what they're finding is there's real value in this. And so they get excited about how if you have a standard operating model and it works for 80% of the patients, it's the outliers that concern physicians, clinicians. And this is a way that they feel our health system is wrapping around them additional resources than they ever imagined when they were going to medical school. And so that's been quite powerful, and one we're really pleased with and proud of the work we've done today.
Yeah, fascinating. That's awesome. And then Rick, one more question from you from this slide as well is just we talked about partnerships and JVs a little bit, but would love for you to kind of drill down into what are the areas of focus today for health systems?
Yeah, I think Mike already really talked about the traditional healthcare ecosystem being ripe for creative and strategic partnerships, but I think there's growing interest in JVs between health systems and payers, either contractual or equity-based, as well as with tech companies and employers. I mean, we know there are partnerships in primary care and behavioral health that are particularly attractive in areas of focus for preventative-based purposes, as we were talking about. That's the core to the value-based business model, as well as access and home-based care models. But I'd like to tell the listeners, just think about how these partnerships could unlock new revenue streams and drive clinical transformation for your own organization. If leaders are focusing on developing a more consumer-centric, data-driven health system that emphasizes pop health over sick care, there's a tremendous opportunity for creative partnership between health systems and tech companies, especially with data health systems have and the scale that tech companies bring. And I think as these two worlds of healthcare and technology innovation merge, there's an opportunity to transform a system that's fragmented, expensive, and inequitable. I think health systems have to execute, though, and think about how to make focus, especially there's plenty of things that are hitting their docket right now, recognizing all the pressures on costs on the labor side. And, there could be just another fire drill that happens tomorrow that changes the way that they think about how they focus on their strategy. And I think cybersecurity is a major component of that, no doubt. I think that's on top of mind for everyone. But I just think the traditional vendor customer relationship has to be evolved.
Let me give out another example, and I've seen it happen twice. Here at Mercy, we partner with GoHealth for our urgent care. And when I was at Trinity working with Dr. Dan Roth, one of the things we uncovered was we had 60 urgent cares. And when we really peeled it back, what we had done is we had hospitalized these urgent cares. And while the best of intentions, the urgent cares that are run by a for-profit is much more efficient. It's leaner. And one of the things that I'll always kind of keep close to my mind when I'm thinking about these issues is that's not our core competency. And sometimes you almost have to do a skunk work where you take something like this and put it off to the side. We finally realized the best way to do this was we partner with Premier Urgent Care and Steve Sellers, who's I think one of the really great operators. And we said, listen, let's come together. We'll invest in your company. You take over our urgent cares. You select the ones that we should keep, whether it be because of location and just the model and all these things. And when it was all said and done, we kept only about a third of them. But by merging with them, we took a best practice and we scaled. And now we have continuity because they were on Epic. So our patients went there, we kept them within the system, and we were able to work together because we were all bearing risk and caring for the same patients. So that's an example. It's low-lying fruit, and a lot of the people on this call have done it already. But sometimes we have to just acknowledge we're not great at everything, and we have to find the partners that will help us through different types of relationship, kind of shore up portions of our portfolio.
Also,
yeah, great points. And small world, I worked a lot with Premier at my old consulting organization. So
there you go.
That's great to hear. Awesome. Well, moving on, kind of our fourth topic here. And we've talked a lot about health system transformation overall. Rick, Mike, you guys, you've talked about knowing what your core competencies are. And there's kind of been a lot of hubbub around provider sponsored plans, some doing well, some not doing well. IU Health selling those assets to Elevance. What's the outlook on just kind of provider sponsored plans, and like, what's your take on, should they be part of a health system? Should they not? Or kind of what's the balance there?
Yeah, I'll start this off, Mike. I think just because we have a provider sponsored plan that's owned by clinicians, but we are sponsor of it on the basis of being Essence Healthcare, sister company. But we work very closely with all our health system partners, provider sponsored health plans. And at one point we directly managed as a TPA to many of those plans. But so let me first address the challenges provider sponsored plans are facing, especially with the news that you just mentioned, IU Health divesting its planned Elevance. Recognizing that some PSPs are struggling to achieve scale, I think many are now exploring either divesting or partnering with large payers to manage risk better. It could be on the administrative side to achieve scale, because the cost per unit to do that across large networks to process claims could be a lot cheaper if you have more and you're at a less people, you have less people to really manage all that administrative overhead. But then it's like network side, you also are managing risk pools that are a lot smaller than many of the large that are facing many of these big headwinds. So you might be encountering adverse selection within your risk pool. And likewise, I think as especially with utilization coming back from COVID, that's not essentially we're ready to take on that big lift in managing that downstream risk for a long period of time. But I'd say likewise, PSPs are better at aligning with providers with their health plans that coming back to like healthcare's local, they've connected with that community very well. I mean, you could be looking at national brands all over the place, but that provider that's aligned with that payer making it a high performing, say, communication mechanism to where there's either authorizations that are effectively coordinated, has an advantage, right? And so like the denials, the prior auth, the other collaborative payer issues, the non-collaborative payer issues that we're encountering in the market, you can make that simpler because there's organizations through a proper firewall, they're still talking to each other on the basis of like, we need to fix these consumer facing problems at the local level. And so I think there's still very much a good value proposition to have a provider sponsored plan. It's just, I think Mike and I always use the term left pocket, right pocket when looking at a health system's corporate structure. And sometimes we get money in and we'd be like, oh, great, this is utilization revenue earned on the fee for service side. Hurrah. But it affects our risk bearing contracts because that utilization may not have been at the appropriate level of care that it should have been. And many of those two P&Ls aren't talking to each other. So those P&Ls have to talk to each other about what the implications are. There's wins on both sides when you can start to bring in the leakage that you're getting in the market to one that's back home, right? And I think that's a fee for service and value-based strategy, is how do you capture the leakage and keep it contained? But has to be the communication if you're owning an asset that is very fixed cost heavy. And then likewise, you can have better outcomes if you're working closely with that plan on the incentives, on the appropriate downstream communication, the administrative stuff. So like I talked about Essence, we're very focused on working with our downstream providers on turnaround time for concurrent and pre-service requests, utilization management, prior auth, claims denial rates, and then CAP scores. And that's essentially why we've created that flywheel to where it's been a 5-star plan over and over again, because gaps in care are closed. They know what's in it for them, and they know exactly what they do to make a good consumer-driven experience.
Yeah, I would. I'll give you two examples of providers having to make a decision. When Rick and I were at Advocate, we wrestled with the idea of whether or not we should stand up our own plan. And part of it has to do with the environment. The most challenging environment to potentially stand up your own plan or to successfully keep running it is when you have a dominant non-for-profit payer in your marketplace. It's a bit of an acronym or a irony that you would call it a non-for-profit, but in our case, it was Blue Cross Blue Shield. And they had 65% market share. So we knew at Advocate we could never stand up a plan because they could drive us out of the business. And so we just instead structured a unique relationship with them to, as Rick pointed, try to remove some of the nuisance and barrier and get to a gold card status and really try to improve cost of care and coordination of care. At Trinity, I had the opportunity to work in Columbus, where Medigold is the largest Medicare Advantage plan. And it's something that was this diamond sitting in the rough, sitting within the portfolio of Trinity. And they've since taken that plan and moved it into Michigan and to Idaho. Now, it takes a while, and its focus is MA, of course. It takes a while to grow it, but it's worthy of a try. And because there was critical mass and talent sitting inside the hub, they've been able to slowly scale this out into other marketplaces. So where we're at right now, where I'm at Mercy, is we are leaning into payers that will pay us appropriately, but are on the journey to value-based care and understand we're also looking at them to remove the burden. I'll just leave it at that's one of the things we value greatly, and it's a conversation that's underway right now in our marketplace.
Yeah, fascinating. That makes a lot of sense. And, maybe that's a good segue, Mike, into just kind of like the next question, working with payers on various value-based care initiatives. Are there any kind of emerging or nascent areas that you perceive a lot of opportunity in? Maybe talk about specialty care or anywhere that's not being discussed broadly?
Well, I think your diagram here to the right is a good one. I've had the opportunity to do a little bit of private equity, and I won't get into any of the specifics about these different entities that are playing in the area, but they're there because private equity appreciates the inefficiency that's currently in place right now in healthcare. And when you look at probably the hottest areas, cardiovascular, because more and more of this care can and is being performed as a day procedure. And once Medicare greenlights ablations, it's going to be a pretty profound movement towards this care being done in an ASC. And so for health systems that are not tied to a larger value-based solution or have not considered what life's going to look like in a couple of years, these private equity players are smart enough to see the inefficiency. And one of the things they're also now recognizing is they have to go directly to the payers as well and potentially take some risk. And the payers are willing to do that as well. And look, they're doing it for a couple of reasons. One, they think they can do it more efficiently than the health system. And number two, the private equity entities also believe it'll improve their multiple at exit. And so whether it's orthopedics, oncology, cardiovascular, or kidney care, all of it is the big spend when it comes to Medicare Advantage, and efficiency always finds interested parties. And I think that's what's going on right now across these 4 service lines and a couple others as well.
Great. Rick, anything to add there, or happy to move on?
No, I was just always fascinated by, as Mike has gone through his career, he's definitely taken on roles in specialty care where, Pop Health is traditionally known from a very primary care centric quarterback of care perspective. But Mike's leadership and going to the specialized side to fully trying to get this team really bought into the incentives. And that's especially where CMS is going, as you saw this administration really investing in specialty care programs. He's following where the puck's moving, and we need to jumpstart that side of the house.
Yeah, well, that maybe you can speak more to that kind of, the CMMI models kind of emerging. Any areas where you guys kind of have raised your eyebrows and said, oh, that this spot's interesting. Maybe we can do something here, those sorts of things.
Absolutely. I mean, for years, we've been talking about how do we create, let's talk about this administration is very focused on specialty care models. They've released a primary, making care primary, which is only in a select set of states. So it's not necessarily nationally scalable. The ACO REACH model we do participate in from a total cost of care perspective, which was traditionally known as direct contracting global professional. And that was something we bought into several years ago. So total cost of care models were very interested in driving risk-based models because primary care, I think, is the major quarterback of that. Now, there are specialty care models that can support that within these total cost of care models. And that's where I also appreciate the investment in some of these shadow bundles for more episodic-based tracking to create awareness with the specialty community, but also look to provide downstream funds flow to them for effective coordination of care. So some of the models that are coming out are also mandatory. So we're approaching one successful attempt, one failed attempt with the cardiac bundles in 2016, and now a third attempt with a merged mandatory bundle model across 5 episodes for joints, hips, spinal fusions, CABGs, and major bowels under this program called Transforming Episode Accountability Model. It has a lot of work still to go to it. I mean, if this survives the election cycle in November, which I think that's where the cardiac one failed in 2016, going into 17, is if it survives and it goes into effect in 2026, there's going to be a significant number of CBSAs under these mandatory bundles, which are at the hospitals convening. And it's not necessarily in coordination with the clinical integration network that Mike and I and Lumis or others that are traditionally involved in convening these risk-based programs. So they're going to be needing and looking towards people to help their transition of how do they get the specialists engaged? How do we have the right analytics to determine whether I have any movement whatsoever in this DRG plus a 30-day post-acute pricing bundle? So that's going to come up fairly quick. 2026 only a year and planning towards it. A lot of organizations that are nascent in value-based models or bundle models. That said, it's still a few DRGs. There's still a way to go that the government can push forth more mandatory models. So I think it's just another telltale sign that just putting this off for another decade, like several folks have done since it started, essentially the Affordable Care Act in 2010, it's going to happen. And some organizations and markets are starting to feel it.
Yeah, I think Rick said it well there. I think the false trap here is to think that this will get kicked down the road. It very well could, but it will happen. And health systems need to start acting as if it's in place now and start to figure out what are the deficiencies. For us, it's, how are we handling these CABG patients and projecting out what the model will look like so that we have a running start, because it helps. It's the right thing to do from a patient care. And then you have to better understand the infrastructure investment and just the information that needs to flow in a much more seamless way.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. And it'll be interesting to see. I know a lot of that kind of mandatory component is top of mind for a lot of folks. So that'll be interesting. Awesome. I'm going to skip our last question on case studies. Maybe I'll do a follow-up in the newsletter on that with you guys. But just flipping over to the audience Q&A, I've got a few good questions here. And so here's a good one. How do you navigate frontline provider behavior change where value-based care contracts may be only a piece and often a small piece of what they see every day? And how do you deal with the fact that most commercially insured patients are in either full fee-for-service or quote unquote baby value-based care contracts? So really a question around behavior change.
I'll take a first swing at this. I think I'm going to answer this question. And again, I apologize if this isn't the starting point of where this question comes from. Let's just use as an example, you have a health system and you're in still a very fee-for-service marketplace, but you're starting to stick your foot in the water. One of the ways that I think, and we learned this from Dr. Lee Sachs when both Rick and I were working at Advocate, having a scorecard that is specific to physicians, primary care versus cardiologists, and start to measure those best practices and to continue to dial that up, I think is critically important. So I would tie it to a bonus system and look for performance, and even just the baby steps of standing up the governance, what is measured, what is an agreed upon best practice, how are we trending year over year. You don't decide to run a marathon and not train for 6 months. At least you don't do that if you want to be able to walk the next day or weeks afterwards. So you have to start to slowly explain, connect dots, measure, and take those baby steps. That's always been, I think, the best recipe. And I think dyad partnership, you have to have a physician partner. I can say the right things. I'm not a physician. I don't see patients. But if I have a dyad partner that can complete the sentence and explain how it can be done, it is received so much better.
And just to add on what Mike said, it's just what I said earlier is he starts with exactly what you do, what Mike's just said, but then you're getting that mind share we're talking about because you're reaching a critical mass, that you're getting more of that experience. You're getting more of those value-based contracts through your managed care team, and then you're really humming.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Great points. I love the scorecard concept. That's cool. I just, feel like in general, that behavioral change challenger has been talked about a lot. So it's interesting to hear kind of practical ways to think about that. Great. Moving on to a next question. This is a question given prior to the webinar by somebody from hospitality, but has behavioral health integration proven an important component clinically and financially? Or kind of how do you guys think about that?
Great question. I would say that behavioral health is probably one of the greatest opportunities across the U.S. healthcare landscape. It's probably the area where we have done the least amount of investment and integration. But when this is an example where sometimes you need that partnership in order to shore up a gap. Is it financially viable? I think I'd look at it differently. What I would say is it's a necessary component of a well-rounded operating model that's going to do well in value-based care. And I think it is rewarded. First and foremost, you're doing the right thing for the patients. And I think it's core to bending the curve and having someone that is a polychronic patient. If you don't address the depression issue, good luck getting them to take their medicine. Good luck to get them to weigh themselves daily. So not appreciating that is likely to have less than desirable outcomes. And so I think as a society, one, we're starting to appreciate that this is an epidemic across all of the United States, and it's certainly hurting us from caring for our patients in the most holistic way. And I think it gets rewarded and appreciated by those that have seen it have an impact on patients with multiple diseases that they're trying to deal with. But until you address the underlying depression issue, and I'm using depression as just one example. It's not, obviously, behavioral health is much wider than that, but it's a perfect example where that's the source. That's the sentinel issue that has to get addressed. And all of a sudden, you make some major breakthroughs. And so it does pay for itself, and it will pay for itself in value-based care. We don't have enough resources. We're excited about some of the stuff we do via virtual care so that we can open up more capacity within our health system.
Thumbs up to that. I think going back to our comment on vertical integration, those that are investing in these downstream assets and behavioral health, I know there's plenty of probably folks in the line right now that are making financially viable business models with behavioral health, no doubt. But even if you're not making money on it and you're still focusing on a fee-for-service chassis that may not have it, if you're a physician, if you're a provider organization that's vertically integrating with a risk-based chassis, as Mike mentioned, it's core. And even if it's a loss leader, it will help the access points.
Yeah, well said. Really appreciate that commentary there. I did a deep dive with NeuroFlow maybe like a couple months ago, and they were talking about how, behavioral health drives so much cost in the system. And so, it is core to strategy, and will continue to be for the foreseeable future. As we've seen all the graphs in the dire state of things. So with that being said, we are right at time for the webinar. So Mike, Rick, thanks so much for being a part of this. Thanks so much for your insights across the board on just this evolving landscape. If anybody on the line has any questions for them, feel free to get in touch with me, and I'm happy to pass them along. Those sorts of things. Rick and Lumis, thanks so much for sponsoring today's session. You guys are doing great work in the space, and have a ton of expertise. Mike, great to hear from you and what you guys are doing at Mercy. And just one more quick shameless plug from my end. If you are kind of in health system, provider, organization landscape, and you're interested in having similar conversations to this and learning about what's going on, we do have kind of more tactical and targeted conversations within my community. So if you're interested in that, feel free to join. It is free to apply. So that's for folks in kind of like strategy and operations and advisory roles around health systems. So thanks everyone for joining today. Appreciate the conversation, guys, and you guys have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Blake. Thank you, Workweek.